government has said that during Operation Protective Edge in 2014 that Israel had a right to defend itself within the limits of humanitarian law. Do you think that what we saw during 2014, the Israeli onslaught on Gaza, was indicative of defensive action being taken by Israel?
I think it was. Anyone who's been to southern Israel and has talked to the people in Ashkelon or Ashdod or Sderot will know that people die as a result of indiscriminate rocket attacks from Gaza, that there is children suffer every day from trauma. No civilized country is going to allow rockets to be fired into its territory with impunity, and the present Conservative government certainly supports Israel's right to defend itself in 2014. Incidentally, there's an interesting point about the International Criminal Court. If the International Criminal Court were so minded as to issue an arrest warrant for Bibi Netanyahu, which is extremely unlikely, but if it were so minded, it would also have to issue an arrest warrant for the Hamas leaders in Gaza, because we have to recognize that every rocket launched from Gaza was itself a war crime, wasn't it?
Okay, Ms. Karen Mustafa, I'll let you answer that. What do you think about overall that actually the British government is saying that Israel was within its right as far as defending its country?
Well, I'm surprised to hear Mr. Alderman actually refer to civilization and a civilized country, bearing in mind that Israel has actually kept the Gaza Strip under siege. You know, this is an expression that we thought was left for history books in medieval times, and yet in 2014, 2015, and indeed since 2007, the Gaza Strip has been under siege. That means that very few people can actually access the Gaza Strip. Only the Israelis decide what goes into the Gaza Strip. And just to give you a slight idea of what it means, how it translates for the Palestinians, Palestinian children can't actually have chocolate because the Israelis have decided that 1,000 calories per head is sufficient for Palestinians, and therefore any extra treat is considered beyond what the Palestinians are allowed to actually have. So to assume that there is a level of civilization in this conflict is, I think, very disingenuous when you realize that, of course, Israel not only has an incredibly well-equipped and sophisticated army with very sophisticated weaponry, but of course it has the protective dome, which actually stops Hamas fire rockets doing any damage whatsoever to Israeli citizens. So the idea of putting the two on a par is incredibly unfair, given that 2,500 Palestinians have died, and on the Israeli side, I think it's been a handful of civilians, and most actually died from friendly fire.
What about what Mr. Alderman said, Ms. Karen Mustafa? He talked about the Israeli kids suffering from trauma.
Well, 500 Palestinian children have died. Scores of Palestinian children don't have access to water, can't go back to their schools because those schools have been destroyed. Scores of Palestinian children have seen their mothers and their fathers actually blown to shreds. I think to compare the fact that some Israeli children have heard some loud noises in their back garden to the actual suffering and the plight of Palestinians is very, very an unbalanced view of what the conflict is about. And I think very much reflects how the mainstream media portrays this conflict as if this was two equal sides. Of course it's not two equal sides. There is an aggressor and an occupying force, which is Israel, and there is the victim of illegal occupation, which are the Palestinians.
Your take, Mr. Alderman, when does an entity have the right to actually defend itself? When we're talking about the words that Ms. Karen Mustafa said, she talked about the occupying force, talking about Israel and what it is doing, especially in the Gaza Strip and in Palestine in general. When does an entity have the right to defend itself? We look at that over 2,000 people were killed, and on the Palestinian side, less than 10, I believe, were killed on the Israeli side. Obviously, not very equal. So, do the Palestinians have a right to try to defend themselves?
Well, I'm very sorry that you find it uncongenial that so few Israelis have been killed by Palestinian rockets. Of course, the Hamas government has a right to defend itself, but we must remember that if we read the Hamas charter, we know what Hamas's end game is, and that is the destruction of Israel. And no Israeli government is going to allow a situation to exist where rockets can be fired into its territory, but it can't take action against those rockets. Some years ago, I offered to my good offices to ensure safe passage for a delegation from the Hamas government in Gaza to Jerusalem to negotiate and sign a definitive peace treaty. And I'm delighted to repeat that offer now, to see that a Hamas delegation goes safely to Jerusalem to sign a definitive peace treaty. I can't be fairer than that.
Mr. Alderman, looking at what you're saying, and I want to also expand the number that we have of Israelis who were killed, because I definitely want to be fair, was 75 in that operation by Israel last year. You said about a peace treaty. We know that Hamas was actually the elected government by the Palestinians in Gaza Strip, which Israel never really accepted. And we see, again, I want to talk about as far as the equity here, or the lack thereof. When you look at 75 people being killed compared to over 2,000 people being killed, with the majority of them being children in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, do you not think that there should be, if you want to say a day of reckoning, or having to answer for that, at least in some court of law somewhere?
The British government in 1945 did not have to answer in any court of law, because in March of that year a botched RAF operation against Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen caused the deaths of over 80 children. There has to be a sense of realism here. And,
so it's not realistic, Mr. Alderman, so it's not realistic that someone should actually go to court for killing over 2,000 people? That's not realistic, sir?
You don't think it's realistic that the Hamas government should be taken to court?
I'm asking you a question. I didn't say yes or no about Hamas. I'm asking you a question about 2,000 people being killed. Do you think it is realistic or not, in the world of 2015, the world we live today, that some entity somewhere should actually have a court that at least it is heard in a court of law whether Tel Aviv is guilty or not of war crimes, sir, for killing 2,000 people, with the majority of them being civilians?
By Tel Aviv, you mean Jerusalem, don't you?
I mean Tel Aviv, sir. I believe that that is the accepted international capital of those who accept it. Answer my question, sir, please. No, it's not. Answer the question.
I refuse to answer a question in which you misdescribe the capital of Israel. The capital of Israel is Jerusalem, isn't it?
By whose definition, sir? By international standards? I don't think so. Ms. Karen Mustafa, if we look at it, Ms. Mustafa, if we look at the situation, and do you not think that when we look at the Western governments and their involvement in this, how much of a responsibility lies on London, lies on Washington, lies on Paris for what we see, these war crimes that takes place by the Israelis?
Well, for one thing, Marzia, I need to just make a slight correction. When you say 75 Israelis died, out of those 75, 68 were Israeli soldiers. They were not actually civilians, whereas the 2,500 Palestinian victims, the overwhelming majority was actually civilian population. So there is a big difference in that figure. Coming back to, it's interesting that Mr. Alderman also mentions the 1940s. I think we could compare the reaction of the Palestinians to the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, who were trying to escape the injustice of the Nazi regime and actually targeted Nazis with any means that they had at their disposal. And I think at the time everyone respected expected that coming from Europe's oppressed Jewish community, and I can see that when we look at the suffering of the Palestinians, we see a strong parallel. Unfortunately, of course, many of those who fled the Nazi atrocities went on to Palestine to commit atrocities against the Palestinians themselves. Now, going back to the responsibility of Western capitals,
30 seconds,
of course they're responsible. They support, they fund, they unconditionally help Israel, and we've seen it obviously with David Cameron's government, and the majority of his cabinet are actually conservative friends of Israel. So their responsibility is very much a large one, and I think with no pressure from all these capitals, we're not going to see much difference in Israel. But
and
I
on
think
that
the
note,
time
I'm
of
so
reckoning
sorry,
is
but I
happening soon.
have to thank both of you. We've come to the end of the time for this program. Mr. Jeffrey Alderman, Professor of History and Politics, University of Buckingham, and Ms. Hafsa Kara Mustafa, journalist and political analyst, also out of London. Appreciate both of you being with us. And as always, viewers, thanks so much for staying tuned to another debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi, signing out from Tehran.